I've always been open to the strange and paranormal, but recently I had an experience that was so bizarre, there's no doubt in my mind that it was real. I live in Big Rapids, Michigan. I have this friend Steve who loves to scour the internet for supernatural and conspiracy stuff. One day he came to my house all excited about something he found on Reddit. To me, that was already a red flag. He said there's been chatter about a supposedly abandoned underground military bunker in the Huron-Manistee National Forests. I'd never heard of anything like that and just laughed at him, but he tried to talk me into checking it out. I was skeptical, but he showed me the Reddit thread, which even had pictures from the alleged site. Someone posted coordinates and landmarks in case anyone wanted to look for it. Here's the thing. There were also sightings of a strange creature in the area, and people speculated that it was connected to the hidden bunker. I know your listeners are familiar with the Dog Man. There's tons of stories on your channel about encounters all over the country. Michigan is actually known for its Dog Man sightings, even in my hometown of Big Rapids. I've heard about it from some of the old-timers, but never seen him myself. The creature that people described sounded a lot like the Dog Man, basically a werewolf-type creature. Steve didn't want to go alone, and I finally gave in, as long as treated me to an 8-corner all-meaty from Jet's Pizza. The Huron-Manistee National Forests cover nearly 100,000 acres. Steve followed a map and the coordinates and took us up a trail, but then we took a narrower trail that went deep into the woods. I had no idea where we were and began to worry. As we hiked, we heard rustling sounds nearby. I was a little concerned because there's bobcats and bears in the forest, and I'm pretty sure we weren't on any kind of official trail. I swore I smelled something too, like rotting meat and sulfur. It didn't bother Steve, so I kept my mouth shut. Then we heard something else. I don't know exactly what it was, but it sounded like a hyena, which would be crazy. It was fairly close too. I said we should head back and that this was just a wild goose chase, but Steve insisted we were close and even pointed to a large white pine with carvings in the trunk he was sure the Redditors mentioned. We finally came upon a small hill that housed a concrete door buried under a bunch of foliage. I couldn't believe it, and Steve had no qualms about rubbing it in my face. Still, I was worried about whatever animal made those weird sounds. Steve was only focused on one thing as he pulled open the door and went inside. I reluctantly followed. We used the flashlights on our phones to look around. It was mostly empty, except for some old beer cans. From the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell how big the place was, but as we went further, I realized it was a sprawling complex. There were several rooms, some with old, dusty tables, cabinets, and gurneys. It looked like a medical or research facility. Steve took a lot of pictures. It's clear it hadn't been used in decades, and I couldn't understand how this place stayed a secret all these years. Steve said the Redditors thought the military did some kind of secret experiments during World War II. I would have laughed before, but at that point I thought anything was possible. He was intent on finding something that would prove those theories, but outside of some old, rusted equipment, there was nothing. I was hesitant to go further as the place proved to be quite labyrinthine. Steve made fun of me, but then we heard noises somewhere up ahead. It was the sound of clattering metal like someone was knocking things over. I grabbed Steve and tried to head back, but he shook me loose and called out to whoever it was, taunting them. I thought he was nuts. Then we heard it, that hyena sound echoing in the concrete maze. It grew louder, and for the first time that day, Steve gave pause. That's when we saw it. At the end of a long corridor, a massive figure emerged. The flashlight wasn't strong enough to get a good look, but it was definitely an animal, prowling on all fours. It was huge, with stringy black fur and a wolf-like face. Steve took a picture, and when it flashed, a hyena laugh erupted from its throat as it stood up on its hind legs. That's when we saw its upper body was actually human-like, with arms that put Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson to shame. This thing was huge, maybe 7 feet tall. Steve screamed and we both turned and ran. We heard the creature galloping behind us, closer and closer. We finally made it to the entrance, slammed the door shut, and kept going down the narrow trail. As we ran, we heard that hyena sound again and something in the bushes behind us. Who knows if it was the same creature from the bunker or another one. We finally made it to the main trail, but we kept going until we got to the car. Nothing followed us. We stood in silence for several minutes as we caught our breath. I had a hard time processing what had just happened, but Steve burst into a wide grin. He was excited about what we saw and that he had proof to prove those conspiracies. Then the color drained from his face as he searched for his phone with all the pictures. It was gone. He probably dropped it somewhere in the bunker or in the forest. I told him there's no way in hell we were going back. He got angry at me and demanded to know why I hadn't taken any pictures. All I could do was shrug. I got an earful from him as we got in the car and drove back. He kept his word, though, and I enjoyed the pizza from Jet's. Turns out I worked up an appetite after almost getting attacked by the dog man. A week later, Steve told me the Reddit thread had been deleted. He thought our encounter had something to do with it, like maybe the military was still watching the place. I thought it was for the better. No one should be snooping around there anyway. I was a volunteer firefighter for a tiny Midwestern town. We would do fire safety demonstrations at our local schools and certain companies in town, but we very rarely had an emergency call. In fact, I only remember 3 fire calls in the town over my 15 years on the job. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, we were a suburb of a decently large city, so that kept us busy. We got a call in the middle of the week, about 11 o'clock at night, that there was a fire at the new town hall. Luckily, no one was inside at the time, and the only thing lost was the building. Our town had just approved the plans for a new town hall and had begun building only a month ago, so it wasn't finished yet. The lot for the new town hall wasn't exactly in town. There was a natural area with prairies and woods and such between downtown and the suburbs. The new town hall was built on a flat area that backed up to a marshland. It was either that, or they would have had to clear a bunch of trees in a wooded area. The marsh was small and flooded sometimes in the spring, but the water never got anywhere close to the spot they were building on. One of the consequences of the town hall being out there was that no one noticed it burning. There were no houses in the immediate area, but I heard there had been plans to clear the forest at some point and develop it. I doubt that plan is still in the works, though. The fire was called in by a young man driving home along the road. It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes from the time we got the call to when we arrived, but the building was completely destroyed already. We beat the sheriff there by a good 10 minutes. We got the fire out pretty quickly, considering. I'd estimate it had been burning for quite a while before we arrived. The only thing salvageable from the building was the cement slab. The sheriff wanted to start an investigation. None of the wilderness areas around the building suffered any damage. It was localized to the town hall. There was no gas or electricity to the building yet, and the workers had been using portable generators. They kept the generators locked up in their trailers overnight, so that didn't look like a likely cause of the fire. We assumed it was likely arson, but there wasn't anyone in town that had any reason to burn down the new town hall. The vote for the new town hall passed unanimously. The building had just begun construction, so all the records were still being stored at the old town hall, which rules out anyone trying to destroy documents. It was a very strange case. This was the type of thing that happened in the city, not our small town. But it gets even stranger. The kid who had called it in stayed there and waited for the sheriff. He said he saw a man in a cape hanging around the outside of the building when it was burning. He described the person as about 6 feet tall and wearing what looked to be a black cape. He couldn't see the face at all, but said they had glowing red eyes. Both the sheriff and I looked at each other and tried to refrain from laughing. A man in a cape with glowing red eyes? Is Dracula our arsonist? I couldn't believe it. The sheriff asked the kid to take a drug test. He agreed and was still adamant that his story was true. That there was a man out there with glowing red eyes, and he last saw him headed towards the marsh. I helped the sheriff rope off the property with caution tape. He decided to start the investigation in the morning when it was light out. As we were making our way around the back of the building, the sheriff noticed footprints in the dirt. I wouldn't have seen them in such dim lighting, but maybe that's why I'm not the county sheriff. I told him they were probably our footprints, since we had been around this side of the building to put the fire out. But he stopped me and said, "These definitely aren't yours unless any of your guys were barefoot." Maybe that kid did actually see someone, but that begs the question. Who on earth is out here barefoot and dressed in a cape setting things on fire? The sheriff tried to get some photos, but they weren't showing up even with a flash. We looked at the camera and it was just a blur. Now, I don't know what made us both turn around and look towards the marsh, but we both did at the exact same time. I can't explain it, but it's like we both just knew something was out there. And something was, in fact, out there. I understood why the kid described the person as wearing a cape. If you didn't see him that well, you would have thought it had to be a long cape wrapped around his arms. But there was a full moon that night, and it gave the sheriff and I enough light to see that was no cape. Those were wings. They were like bat wings. No feathers. And its eyes were definitely red. The sheriff yelled out to the creature, but as soon as he did, it disappeared into the marsh. He and I both stood there with our eyes fixed on the marsh for I don't know how long before I finally spoke. "Are you going to go after it?" I asked. The sheriff said, "Heck no." And that was the end of our conversation. The final results of the investigation were inconclusive, but I know that thing started that fire. I figure that must have been its land or something. The new town hall was moved to another area and we never had any more problems. I was a park ranger at Yosemite National Park. Let me start off by saying we thought we were going to catch one. I mean, we almost caught one. I've been a ranger for 7 years and I've never experienced anything like this. This happened in 2017, and I was working the overnight shift at the Tuolumne Meadows campground during the summer. It was around 2 a.m. when I first saw what I believed was a Sasquatch. It was walking along the Tuolumne River, about 50 yards from the campground. I was surprised by how large it was. It looked like a very large man with long dark hair and a full beard. The creature walked in an odd way, almost like it had a limp or something. It seemed to favor its right leg foot as it walked along the riverbank. I watched for several minutes as it made its way downriver, then disappeared behind some trees and bushes. I went inside my ranger station to grab my flashlight and camera, but when I returned outside, the Sasquatch was gone. I spent several minutes scanning the area with my flashlight but did not see anything unusual. After work that night, I reported what I saw to another ranger who worked at Tuolumne Meadows overnight that week, but he told me he didn't see or hear anything unusual during his shift that night. He said there were no other reports of anything in the area that summer, so he didn't believe me at first, but after hearing my story, he agreed to spend his next shift patrolling the area where I saw it. That next night, my fellow ranger ended up seeing it around the same time at night. It was approximately 2:30 a.m. Maybe they are nocturnal, and that's why they avoid being seen. He saw it walking along the riverbank, and he also described it as limping. That morning, he walked along the riverbank, and it was sitting there injured and moaning. He quickly returned to the ranger station and got his tranquilizer gun. When he returned, it was still there. This was roughly 5 a.m. in the morning. He kept his distance and shot it with the tranquilizer gun. It was definitely angry when it got hit, and it stood up and took off into the woods. It was moaning as it ran away, but the tranquilizer didn't seem to affect it. My fellow ranger said he chased after it but lost sight of it in the trees. He returned to the ranger station and grabbed a spotlight and went back out looking for it, but never found anything. I have heard stories from other rangers about Sasquatches being seen at Yosemite National Park, but I finally saw one myself, and so did my fellow ranger. I believe what we saw was a Sasquatch,